Welcome to this webinar organized by GCF, which is Global Challenges Forum. My name is Santosh. Today we're going to be listening in on a conversation between Dr. John Dayal and Dr. Gnanakan. We've already heard a bit of their conversation, but later on they're going to be discussing the socio-economic challenges confronting our country. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has changed our lives drastically. And I'm sure many of us have seen some of the statistics. During the lockdown, it's estimated that 140 million, that's 14 crore people, lost their jobs, while for many others, they faced salary cuts. And I know there are some on this call who've probably faced that too. Right now, we're in the middle of Unlock 4. A number of economic activities have been resumed, and at the same time, the COVID-19 cases continue to rise. And so the life versus livelihood debate rages on. Whether you call it a pandemic or a plandemic, if you've been reading the conspiracy theories, you would have heard this term plandemic. Whatever you call it, we can see the effects all around our country, and we are facing a number of challenges today. Before we start, a couple of quick introductions. John Dayal is a highly acclaimed journalist and a human rights and political activist. He is an alumnus of St. Stephen's College in New Delhi, where he studied physics before entering the world of journalism. Since then, he has investigated a number of cases of human rights abuse aimed at minority groups. John Dayal is outspoken, he's a familiar face on TV, and I personally know that he loves a good cup of coffee. Welcome, Dr. John Dayal. Dr. Gnanakan is the founder of the ACTS Group of Institutions, formerly known as ACTS Ministries. Dr. Ken has a PhD from London University. He's a writer, a teacher, a musician, singer, artist, gardener, and a cancer survivor. I hand over the rest of this meeting to Dr. Gnanakan. All yours.
Thank you, Santosh, and welcome, John.
Thank you.
Before I hand over to you, John, I'll say a few words, and you are going to say a few words too, and then we'll engage in a conversation. I think, you know, one of the main problems we're facing with the post-COVID reality, with all the lockdowns and the economic shutdowns and things, is a very sharp economic slowdown. You know, India was one country that was touted as one of the fastest growing economies at one time. The World Bank said it, the IMF said it, but suddenly COVID comes and our Achilles heel is exposed. As a result, there's rising unemployment. We've heard the figures from Santosh. It's terrible. The picture that you saw on your screen with people lined up, they're lined up probably either to get some food or to get employment. And it is, you know, just a cry that from deep within our heart, we are looking at these things. In spite of all of the education that we claim to have had, the English that brought us so much of the foreign, you know, call center and the IT kind of jobs, in spite of that, our educational standards, our literacy rates are really low. And particularly as you go into the rural areas, it is really disheartening, and you've got to really look at it. And most of you are educators. We need to be doing something and not just catering. We look at the urban reality and think all is well, but you just go out of the urban centers and you'll see the kind of thing we're talking about. The other thing is the poor infrastructure that we have. As these people have gone back to their small towns, their villages, after being sacked, after being, you know, the whole company is closed down and laborers have gone back home. You see them struggling with the poor infrastructure where they go. And even in our big cities, the slums, and it is really a thing that we need to be concerned about. And finally, with all of this, there is a growing disparity, a disparity. The rich are remaining rich, they're not losing very much, but the poor are getting poorer and the gap is widening. And John, I'm sure you will address some of these issues. So with a real sense of joy having you on this program with us, webinar with us, I hand over to you. Take it over, John.
Thank you very much, Ken. I will not take it over. We will continue our conversation because that is the way to go. Webinars can be so boring because it's like attending a big lecture in a huge hall. Chap comes, speaks, and goes away. And unless he's a stand up comic, we can't even laugh. So there's absolutely no participation. And I'm looking forward to participation. I was also, in fact, looking forward to this webinar, not only to see old friends like you, and you're looking good, I must say. Of all your many talents that Santosh listed, the one I hold the dearest and I think the most powerful is cancer survivor. Because that rings a bell now. We will have a generation of COVID survivors. COVID survivors, in a way, are all and each one of us, the entire 1.3 billion people of India and the 7 billion people of the world. We're COVID survivors in our own way. But I ask myself, and I'll use that as my opening statement, so to say, what will I remember the year of the Lord 2020, the 2020, as and for? I prepared a small note. So for sake of brevity and for clarity, let me just sort of read it out to you from the screen. What will I remember 2020 as and for? And I say that at a very personal level. On the 2nd of October, a few days from now, is my birthday. I'm well into my 70s. And when I celebrate my birthday, which is unfortunately always a dry day for as long as I can remember, for me, it is also Advent and Christmas and Happy New Year, and it's a new year. So the last 2 months just fly off. For me, the year 20 is almost over. What do I remember it as? Not for the virus. The COVID, I'm told, has a long tail with ever new afflictions and weaknesses surfacing months after doctors have said that you're healed. Friends have been writing to us, journalists, and telling, some of them have come on TV and said that they were healed. And then they discovered shortness of breath and lung issues, and the worst that scared the crap out of me, lapses of memory. As it is in our age, we do forget names, and once in a while, Shakespeare is no longer our favorite tome to quote long passages from. But to be worried about not remembering a friend or losing memory or losing a thread is scary. So, despite all that, it's not for COVID that I will remember. You know, most of us have, and that's why I recalled your survival. We have faced death before, and we have come through because the Spirit of the Lord was with us, and the time He gave us was not then. One day, surely, our time will come. So therefore, it is not for COVID, I remember. I will not even remember it for the lockdown. I mean, for me, the lockdown continues from my 6th floor apartment. I have many comorbidities, the least of which is diabetes, 4 insulin shots a day. But, and therefore I cannot move out. I only go to the dentist and back whenever I need to, and not even to a general hospital for fear. And what can I say? The fear itself is something that I should remember, but I will not. Because I read papers, I talk to my friends, they phone me up. People in Kashmir have been in a lockdown for months on end without electricity, without internet. The two are almost mutually dependent, without mobile phones for long stretches, under police guard, under house arrest, under virtual house arrest. People in the Northeast, for them, this comes and goes. It is not as if an area has been allocated. Some nice young boy suddenly says something and his village is put under a lockdown. We know what the situation is. A petrol, somebody throws a stone, and the area is there. So the entire Northeast, and now most also because of the border situation, all of them have been facing a lockdown for months and months and months, and we don't even think about it. So it's not even the lockdowns and all the crises that continue to be impacting us personally. Not being able to go to the library, which for me is terrible. Not being able to go to the club, to the bar, to the church. Not being able to take Holy Communion for a Catholic. Because now the priest won't come to my house. I can't go to the church. And Sunday worship on TV is fine. It's very good. All of us were listening to Radio Ceylon and Christian broadcast from there, but it is not the same as listening to Pastor Ken face to face, as feeling his hand on your head, as talking to your neighbor, as transferring the peace of Christ to your neighbor, of greeting each other with the sign of the folded hands. It's not the same. And that should be something that should have seared into our mind. But I tell you not. One of these days, as soon as I start going back to church and I start meeting my friends in the library, and I can fly down to Bangalore and meet all of you, I'll forget it, that we were so bound. But what I will not forget, and I am the person who wrote books, 2 books on the emergency, which was in 1977, 43, 44 years ago. So we have seen the worst of times. We have seen the Golden Temple raided. We've seen all of that. We've passed. We've seen 7 governments in 8 years. The total impermanence of governance we have seen. So this is not that we are new babes. We are a new republic. That is the first time we are seeing what is it. We are not like a new Christian who has been touched by the Holy Spirit, but finds other things strange. Find it strange that we greet each other, that sometimes we kiss each other, that we eat on Sunday and we call it the blood and flesh of Christ. So some of the cultural aspects of Christianity may sound strange to somebody who's a Christo Bhakt from Banaras. But when governance fails, that is very drastic. It's impacting not just John Dayal, it's impacting everyone. And when governance fails, the apparatus of the state was hijacked to wreak havoc on the institutions that underpin secular democracy. All of us know that. We see TV. I've been saying since March. I come on TV once in a while, but it's on Skype. So I am in a way insulated. I don't participate too much on the TV. But the institutions that underpin secular democracy, parliament, judiciary, media, administrative system, the bureaucracy, police, the Reserve Bank and its resources, Ken started it on an economic thing. The Reserve Bank is more than just a bank. It is like the liver. It's like the bile duct. It absorbs all the poison. It feeds the system when it needs. It is in many ways a parallel government, part of the government, but not really part of the government that way. And therefore, the Reserve Bank, the way it has been treated, its health at the moment is far more worry, I would say, than the economy, core economy. And I will come to that. I've mentioned already the bureaucracy and the police. And from that, the plummeting GDP. What does the GDP mean? Nobody's using, nobody's buying. Obviously, the GDP will go down. There is no gross domestic produce apart from paddy. What will you do with so much paddy? People in North India are dumping milk after skimming the cream into the gutters. They can't even feed pigs because, as they do in America, because our piggery industry is very small and cows don't drink their own milk. Tomatoes are rotting because there's no transport to begin with, and by the time they come, the price is so low, the support prices are not there. So apart from agriculture, which is producing but not selling, where the farmer is producing but not being able to buy things he needs because his produce is not anything. And that's a fake green light that the government keeps on saying, that while we plummeted in industry and everything else, including white goods, so low our agriculture was green, blue line, black line, whatever you call it. That is fake, because what will the farmer is not eating his produce. He has to sell it, convert it into currency. And that part of the economy is not failing. And that is not there. Ken mentioned something. He showed you pictures of the migrant labor. He showed you the pictures facing one way. But they went back and they came back and they came back and they went back. They're shuttling for the last 1.5 months between the village and Bombay and Delhi and Chandigarh and Pune. They go back to the village and discover there's no work. There never was work, which is why they came over to begin with. And they brought their families with them and their relatives. And now when there's no work, they go back, and they go back in rotten conditions. The railways that the government put up lost their way. All of us, including me, paid people to get trucks and buses to take these people home. Caritas, CASA, Eficor, the evangelical churches, all of us contributed money to transport these people back from their closed shops and closed construction sites to the home. And they went there, and now we are transporting them back. How long will they keep on shuttling and finding closed doors or hunger? What will happen to them? And meanwhile, what will happen to their children and their wives? And because they are not being assured things, construction is not starting, there's no capital, and industries are looking for, even Maruti, the biggest of them, has said it's not going to produce as much as it wanted to. Nobody wants to flood the market knowing that there is no liquidity in the market to buy the stuff. And this is something that should go up, up and up, but it is not going up and up at the rate, because the Reserve Bank, the government of India, the finance ministry, the absent finance minister are not able to intervene as they should. But meanwhile, John Dayal's fear of not leaving the sixth floor, the larger fear of the people, the ban on public gatherings, the COVID-induced silence has enabled the government to do what it wishes. The current play that they're doing with the states on GST. You don't want to transfer money to the government of the states. How are they going to run? India is still, mercifully, a federal society. You can't play politics with GST. GST itself was a bit of a politics, but maybe a nice one. We all want uniform rates, which have not happened, by the way. There are still a dozen different grades. But the money was supposed to be shared, and you're not sharing with the states. You're betrayed the federal system in the most important manner of the funding of the state democracy. And that is critical. But it's not just the GST. You've used the COVID silence to weaponize many other instruments. Just not because I suppose all of us are Christians, we are worried about FCRA, Foreign Contributions Regulation Act, apparatus, laws. It was, and I tell you, I've always called it, it was a law conceived in sin, because Mrs. Indira Gandhi thought of it to curb dissent against her, to control organizations which were Hindu, which were Gandhian, the Gandhi Peace Foundation. And then she and everybody else all along then have found it very convenient to try to see if they can keep the church and church bodies under control. But now they've totally weaponized it. Yesterday, about a dozen more. I mean, already from hundreds of thousands, it came down to 25,000, only 22,000 then. And now you're trimming it away. Ultimately, I don't know what will remain apart from PMKs and anybody who wants to fund it. If you've weaponized FCRA, a benign thing, and let me shame the government using your platform. It was in this whole business I just talked to you about, when we were transporting migrant labor from closed doors of factories to their homes. It was the Eficor, it was CASA, it was Caritas. 1.5 crore or more people were fed, Medicaid, transported by Christian organizations who can't get the money from John Dayal. I'm poor. They can't get money from the poor tribal Christians. We get money from Germany. We get money through FCRA from our patrons or friends to essentially educate the larger Hindu masses, feed the larger Indian people, run hospitals for the larger Indian people. And we proved that FCRA was one of the most functional and the most touching instrument that was available in the crisis of the
John, can you begin
lockdown.
to run down? Can you begin
Yeah,
to?
just very quickly, very quickly. And from there, we come to two things. The targeting of religious minorities, Muslims most of all. But I've always said, if Muslims are not safe in India, Christians can't be safe in India. I mean, this is a binary, a bipole. We sink or swim together. And let there be no doubts about it. We may not like them, we may have our fears, we may be inherent Islamophobics, we know what happens in the ISI, etc. But religious minorities have been targeted together with the curbs on the freedom of the expression. But, and again, Ken has already sort of preempted me. Who has benefited? Crony capitalists, Adani, Ambani, and just a few, very few handfuls of people they were the only ones who added trillions to their worth.
Can you
Trillions
take
of rupees.
another minute, John?
I'm just concluding. So the last line is the political nightmare stinks. The political landscape is colored by congealed blood and the frozen tears and shrieks of the victims of which Ken and I both spoke. For me, India is very rapidly sinking into a purgatory instead of a healthy, vibrant, breathing, happy democracy. It was, even in the worst of times, even during the emergency.
Good.
That was my closing slide.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you. You have flaunted your Catholic credentials very, very strongly, and we recognize. But there are a number of Hindus and a few Muslims in this audience. And you mentioned Christian organizations getting in and helping. With your knowledge from the center there, how much of the Muslim organizations and the Hindu organizations, aren't they all doing things that benefit the communities?
Indeed, indeed. Caritas is a global thing. Caritas is the love. And nobody does it better than the Sikhs. The Gurdwaras were always open. Now, instead of people coming to the Gurdwaras are going to the people with the langars, with the bucketfuls of food and sweets and chapatis and sabzi. They're doing that. Mosques opened up. And I mentioned religion in a big way because you turn to God more in these times. Gurdwaras opened themselves up for Muslims to pray and vice versa. So when I mentioned Christians in the context of FCRA and the curbs to constrict the liberty and the activities of people, but when it came to helping others, help came from quarters which were there, but it was the widow's mite. I've seen from because my daughter is active and she goes out, and I get all these visuals on YouTube. Everybody opened up, but not the government. And that was what I was trying to point out. The government apparatus just couldn't make up its mind.
Yeah, I want to come to that, but you know, the pandemic is not partial to any particular community. It's brought all of us together. We've broken down barriers. We seem to be closer to our neighbors, regardless of caste, creed, community, you know. And so I think the kind of common realities are, you mentioned fear. Fear is something that paralyzes the people all over. And is there this kind of a fear from the government about what is going to be, what is happening? You're looking at, you know, you're mentioning what the government is doing, and they're bungling in some ways. But is there any fear at all in them that the country is going downhill?
No, first, if I may just add, because you did say something which is, please do not forget that the government even used COVID to stigmatize communities. They used COVID to say people are spreaders, hyper spreaders or maxi spreaders of COVID. And that is where it starts, the targeting, turning neighbor against breaking the love that this larger uh, understanding of what was happening brought us together. But you wanted to divide that. You wanted to ask people not to be so close to each other in your common suffering, but to be wary of your neighbor, not because it was a particular carrier of COVID, but because he was a particular person and therefore a bigger carrier of COVID. So the fear starts even there. And I think government has persistently and consistently used fear. They've used fear, the biggest fear, by banning public gatherings. I tell you, we can do many things in webinars, but we cannot protest on a webinar. We cannot protest. Protest has to be seen. It has to encourage people. Protest has to be seen by the government. It is supposed to, if not paralyze government, it is supposed to convey through the police barrier, through the, the notification that you give them, the memorandum that you give them to the government, that the people are angry, they're annoyed. Just now, this big cord, the spinal cord, full of neurons and nerves that communicates to the government the feeling of the people, that has been quite deliberately desensitized, anesthetized, you could say, by government using COVID and in the fear of COVID, introducing many other laws. And that is something like a dentist, you know. First, they give you a small injection to deaden the nerve, and then they do something which they've been doing to my teeth, the root canal. They totally kill the nerve. After that, you don't feel nothing. And that is what it is currently there. The government is not feeling.
John, before we begin sounding too anti-government, now let me say, others, if there are questions or comments, just put them into the chat box, and I'll ask Santosh to monitor that and give us any significant comments or significant questions. And John, before we start sounding anti-government, isn't there something good that the government is doing to lift up the social status, to lift up the economic status? State governments or...
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely. Government is not just New Delhi. There's tremendous work being done in the states. Some of them are fumbling about it, but all of them are trying to do the best. Kerala is an example, although just now Kerala is still grappling with a second wave of COVID. But they did teach us how to trace COVID, testing it from one to another, how to localize it, how to control it. They also showed us, and the second wave is because all the workers wanted to come home. Otherwise, they would have contained it. Even Karnataka, a government which I don't particularly like, they've done tremendous work. In Bangalore, much has been happening there. Tamil Nadu, which is a non-government, even they are doing something. Andhra is the current hotbed, but both Telangana and Andhra, still work is being done. Orissa, where Mr. Patnaik works by not working, they have been able to still do something. Bengal, which is targeted by the center, still is doing. So in a way, Rajasthan is a great example. Punjab is another great example. The only work being done at the moment, and forgive me for differing with you on this one, is the success of the federal structure. And therefore my first worry, the federal structure is the life of India. We survive because the state governments can compensate when the center fails. Remember, when Indira Gandhi was losing in the north, the south came to her rescue. And I don't mean it personally to her, but the point was they offset it. In the education policy, it is South India, particularly Tamil Nadu, which will eventually restore a sense of balance in a very lopsided policy. And therefore, I think we should rejoice in the variety we have in the states and the
Good,
work they do in the states.
good,
But many of us are ruled directly by the center, and there comes the crisis.
good. I think we needed that little corrective that there are things happening. Now you mentioned, you referred to the GDP and you referred to the agriculture being the main little thread that they're hanging on, and the agricultural produce itself not able to reach where it needs to go. But isn't that something that we should be happy about? Because agriculture, at least we're being fed. We are being fed, and we can, those of us who are magnanimous, can look at the food that is around and even contribute to spread it around. So it's not a bad thing that
Well,
agriculture.
it's the grace of God. Agriculture is working well for three reasons. The last monsoon was not bad. The current monsoon is very good. The agricultural produce is in a surplus. We need to buy it off the farmers. Last year, you'll recall the support prices, government allowed private traders to come in. And sometimes, because government can be quite funny, I'm not saying the Mr. Modi government, any government, the collector, the tehsildar, his government. And they can say that this nice mound of wheat is very nice, but the price will not be the support price. It will be the subordinate support price because the quantity of moisture is too much. And the poor chap says, I'd better sell it to the Marwadi or the trader who's giving me cash. And now I don't have to wait for 8 months to get the money. So for the farm produce to ultimately help the country's economy well, and I'm not an economist, I trained to be a physicist and then learned mass communication. But they will tell you that the crop itself has to be monetized. Even America, and there you could see the trap, they had an excess of grain or of corn, and they fed it to the pigs. And they had an excess of pigs because the slaughterhouses were closed. They couldn't transfer the corn into protein, and they couldn't market the protein for want of butcher houses and so on and so forth. It's a complex chain. And I think that complexity, and here also something vicious has happened, and not because of the COVID. It is the last year's ban, now it's almost 2 years, on the trading of cattle. And whole sector industry and a link between agriculture and industry and urbanization and exports has been severed. Leather, leather and meat. And that is a third crisis. So agriculture will eventually is a buffer, but alone it helps. It's a good thing to talk about, but it is not going to get Maruti to start producing cars and all the white goods and other things which are the mass producers and are the mass employers of semi-trained people. And
So
you did mention in the beginning about the IT sector. That too will depend on how people buy things, you know.
yeah, yeah. And you point out the interrelation of all these things, which is, so agriculture is there, but there are people with vested interests who keep the price at a particular level so that it becomes inaccessible to those who have lost their jobs, those who are, hungry and wanting something. So we need to be doing something. And here, the point that I need to, segue into is when we talk about the government and keep pointing fingers at the government, you mentioned, it's the smaller tehsildars, they're the government also. But to a large extent, we are the government also. We are the people. And what are we doing? That's a question that we must tackle, isn't it?
Indeed so. Indeed. Ultimately, we, the people, that's the preamble of the Constitution. It's a Constitution we gave to ourselves. It wasn't imposed on us by the British. It's a Constitution we gave to ourselves. But how do the people express their ownership of India.
Mm.
How do we express our ownership of India? It's through the ballot. And I hate the death penalty because it is so violent, it is bloodthirsty. People still love it. But the point is, the only way we can only own the country through the ballot box. That comes once in 5 years. Having bestowed power on the people, and I would say that our rulers are so ordained by God, and it's not the old cynical phrase, we get the rulers we deserve. They've been given a mandate, and they'll be judged by how they fulfill that mandate. And if they don't multiply the 10, what they have, and they bury it, it'll be taken away from them. Sure
Good.
enough, I quite follow that.
Yeah.
But
We'll move on to some of the questions that are coming in. I can see, Santosh, you want to read
Yeah,
some
we
of
have a
those questions?
question from Paul Mohanraj. He says, COVID-19 seems to have emerged bigger than all governments. Have we reached a place where we have become helpless in terms of economy, health, and education? Is there any hope? Listening to this conversation, I'm feeling quite hopeless. So is
John.
there any hope?
COVID impacts the worst in countries which are the biggest in economy, population, geography. Please understand, Japan is not in a crisis. Vietnam, Laos is not in a crisis. Singapore itself is not in a crisis. New Zealand wasn't in a crisis. The smaller republics of Europe are not in a crisis. With the large populations, large people unemployment. In the US, they give, and India does not, a quarterly unemployment index. They give you the figures. So from the unemployment, you can gauge the health of the country. It's the large countries where the economy is such an elephant. You don't know how sick it is. And you don't know how healthy it is because it moves slowly. It can collapse suddenly, but it gets up very, very slow. And that is a crisis of large economies. Even the US, once it recovers, is not going to suddenly jump. Mr. Gates is going to get rich, but the blacks, the white unemployed, they're going to get their jobs very,
So
very
you're saying
slowly.
really, India being a large country, we have to be wary of where we're going. So there is, in a way, a sense of hopelessness that we've got to get over, get
Sure.
past, because COVID is a reality we've got to live with.
COVID is a reality. We have to live with it. The vaccine will come, but people are confused whether the vaccine is a cure. The vaccine is not a cure. The vaccine will prevent COVID next year or the year after. It is not going to suddenly
In
cure
fact, they're
everything
saying
over.
just three to 6 months of vaccine kind of impact, continues. So it's really hopeless.
It's like the injection they give in the teeth. It wears off after a while, and the virus mutates into a bigger form.
Yeah, you seem to be having a lot of dental, visits at the moment.
Because they
I'm
were closed.
thinking a
They were
lot, so
closed for 4 months. Hospitals were open, but all dentists were closed.
I was going to say because he talks a lot, but that would be rude. There's a follow-up question. So what do you think governments should be doing other than what they're already doing?
They should be listening to the specialists. They should be listening to the medical doctors. They should be listening to how to isolate people, how to cure symptomatically medicine. They should be listening to the economists. The economists are suggesting on a daily basis. I read the papers. I spend a lot of time on the edit pages and the op-ed pages. They're giving you sound advice. Follow it at the state level, at the panchayat level, and at the central level. Follow experts. Collect them together. The planning commission you killed, but still the Prime Minister's Economic Council, the other groups are there. They are suggesting don't do things in an arbitrary manner.
yeah.
Don't be impulsive about it.
So, I can see a kind of an arrogance sometimes that though the experts will say something, they make all of this into a political kind of a statement. Your friend Harsh Mandar was with us recently on a webinar,
Yes.
and he gave us insights into the economic challenges that our country is facing, and introduced, at least, brought to us the word empathy, which we need to be developing at this time. This is is one of the main things as we reach out, as we feel for people. So whether it's the experts or whether it's the people who are suffering, to reach out, to empathize with what they're saying and what people are going through.
How can you empathize if you don't listen?
Yeah,
Listen to them, hear what they're saying,
yeah, yeah.
and then you will come to a conclusion. Empathy is God's gift, really, to man and to institutions. Are collectors or sub collectors, are they empathizing? They are doing such arbitrary things. I'll give you a crude example. Suddenly, on the labor that gathered at a place, and you're shown pictures, they started spraying them with the sodium hypochlorite or something of that sort. You are treating them as if they're cattle. You know, when you shear sheep, after you remove the wool, you give them a dip so the ticks die off. People are not animals. Treat them as human beings. Don't throw
Good.
chapatis at them. You locked them up in Delhi. You locked all the Muslims of that place in a jail. And
Yeah.
you were throwing food at them. That's not the way a
Mm.
man treats a man.
Mm. I think,
Empathy.
the kind of empathy, we need to be developing that up. Yeah, it's the need of the day. Santosh, any other questions there?
Sunil Samuel has said, what will the impact of these natural calamities and now the threat of war have on our country and our economy?
The one distracts from the other. This was a time for the subcontinent to come together. This was a time for peace. This was a time that the millions of dollars, not rupees, that are going into the purchase of weapons, and I'm not talking Rafale, I'm talking post-Rafale weaponry that we are buying on the spur of the moment, democratic process that was there even 2 years ago. The threat of war, and I am a war correspondent. I've studied and strategic relations. These are all uncalled for things at the moment. There's nothing. You spoke of empathy. I talk of discussion. You said I'm being very hostile to the government. I was not being hostile. But if we don't spell it out, if we don't, like Moses, like anybody else, condense it into the bare points, howsoever harsh they look, they're not harsh once you put them back in context. We need peace on the borders.
I think
Absolute peace.
you've used a very important, interesting word, distraction. This seems to be the game the governments play, and I'm not trying to be anti-government over here, but somehow what is happening in Ladakh and Kashmir and all that seems to be in Pakistan just a distraction for us from the main issues that we are facing, the socio-economic challenges, and rightly said. Any other questions, Santosh?
I was just going to say these are the oldest tricks in politics, so we shouldn't be surprised. Shailaja has a comment. She says, "Sir, we need to think about changes we can bring about in our lifestyles around us locally and then globally, and together contribute to overcome this pandemic. We also need to keep a track of government policies. There are a number of policies." So that's a comment from Shailaja.
I'll take that comment, Santosh, and convert it into a kind of question that I'll address John. John, you talk about being, a diabetic patient. You have the morbidity, fear, and there are a number of people like that, and the kind of situation that they are going through is really frightening. Do you see some way in which we can get over that and continue
I've
life?
got over it. And I'll give you an example how I got over it. In the third week of the lockdown, my insulin and some of the other things that I take ran out. Or I was afraid they would run out for the next 3 days. I put out a post, Mr. Prime Minister, My insulin is running out. What do I do? It was not the government of India that responded. It was not the state that responded. It was not even my friends, the church, that responded. One idiot friend of mine, a lawyer, said, "But why don't you go to the chemist and buy them?" But who responded? An unknown small group of teachers and students. I got an instant message. "Sir, please tell us what are the medicines. Give us on the message medicines dosages. We'll get you."
So now
In
you
the
can see there.
No, one second, one second, one second.
Yeah.
In the evening at 9 o'clock, a 21-year-old third-year student from my old college, I discovered later, drove on a scooty after delivering food to various hutments. I was the last call. He called me up at 9:30, "Sir, come to the gate to collect your medicine."
Mm. So I think,
I
you
was,
know,
what
yeah,
do you, I had tears in my eyes.
yeah. This is the empathy we've been talking about. And I think the issue that I was going to get to is uh, lifestyle changes are going to come about. And whether we're diabetics or cancer survivors or, BP, patients, whatever, there needs to be some lifestyle changes which will definitely, well, as the environment is healing around us, the body too, has great resilience and it can come through. Don't you think so?
But unfortunately, evolution, and I tell you as a student of science and the history of science, evolution is based on the survival of the fittest. Humanity is based on the collective survival of all, including the weakest. That is the empathy that we want. We must take the poor with us. I and you, I mean, you more than me, but even I can change lifestyles. I'm fitter today than I was in March because I'm more disciplined, enforced
Exactly.
discipline, but disciplined. I keep a stock of insulin. I do all the walking in the corridor that I need to. But what about somebody who needs protein? What about the child who needs
Yeah,
milk? And when you close down schools, you're not depriving the child of education alone. It is not the digital divide alone. You're depriving a village child of
yeah.
the midday meal, which many times was the only meal they had. I know so many cases I've seen with my own two eyes where the child would take a portion, eat half of it, and take the other half for the non-school going sibling.
Good. I
You've
think
deprived.
you spelled it out very fairly clearly, and what you have experienced as a diabetic will introduce lifestyle changes, at least in the urbanites. The rural people and the ones who are suffering. It's a different kind of kettle of fish. Santosh, any other question?
Yeah, we have a question from Alan, not in the UK. He says, in the UK, we've moved gradually from what is good for our neighbor and for our community to what is in it for me or what is good for me. There is a greater polarization within the UK, and he asks if that is happening and applies to India. And do you think polarization will hinder recovery?
John.
No, when polarization takes place in a very unequal way, we are not heading for a civil war. It is not a polarization down the middle in terms of, let us say, ethnic violence or communal violence. It is the underprivileged who get the short end of the stick. They are under pressure. And that is not really polarization as you and I would understand polarization. That is a straining, a sieving away of the dispensables. And that makes it so cruel. And I would say, I should have rephrased my opening statement. I would say political cynicism is the thing that COVID would be marked for. We have become cynical as government and as people. We have no qualms in exploiting. We have no qualms in doing whatever
Yeah.
is evil. And that is the reverse of empathy.
Unfortunately, the politicians take every situation and politicize it, and we can't help it. I know what's happening in England, Alan. There's been a lot of news coverage in our side of the world as well, especially from BBC and CNN, and seems to be getting worse. So, John, your question, your statement about the larger countries suffering more, you know, England seems
It's
to
a
be
lot.
probably it. Yeah.
England is a large economy. England is
Okay.
a
Okay.
is, a,
You,
is
you
an
meant
economy. Yeah.
you meant large economy. Santosh, any other question?
Um, from Srikanta Benjamin, in the village, livelihoods are the same as they were before COVID. They're not acknowledging the consequences of COVID. So, what do you suggest? What do you suggest to those who live in the rural areas?
No, it cuts both ways. Uh, if by rural you mean a large village in Bihar without sanitation, people living close together in their home units, but the Dalit living separately and the upper caste living separately. Hygiene is very bad. Situation is bad. But when in the field, there's a natural separation between people, the air moves on, the droplets are not there. So the environment is healthier. But the trauma there is not of health, it's of health management and it's of livelihood. We seem to also have a very romantic view of the village. Not everybody has land. The landless outnumber the landed, even the small farmer. The largest population is of the landless labor. Then comes the small and marginal farmer. Then comes the farmer who has land on which he can live, his family can live and find surplus to sell. So the other people are suffering because they have to buy their food. It's funny, it's contradictory. Landless farmer and farm labor have to buy grain. They
Mm,
don't grow it in their backyard.
mm. The situation, you know, that the pandemic brought about was the reverse migration that took place. Hundreds, thousands of migrant laborers going back to their villages, towns, and their slums, and that increased the kind of susceptibility to disease and as you said, in the villages, in the slums, the how can you keep a social distance? Uh, you can maybe wear a mask, but safe distancing is a thing that is not possible in some of these densely populated areas. And I don't know whether in England that's the case in some of the sections. Good. Santosh, any other?
Maybe in the Hebrides or wherever you're quite safe, but not in not
Yeah,
in South London.
Okay,
yeah.
another question. Are we overreacting to this pandemic? When you look at the figures today, as of today, there are 9 lakh active cases out of a 1.3 billion population. Um, there are many stories about deaths that are not really COVID related, but due to other causes. So, how do we balance what's happening? How do we sift the news that we're getting? What is the real story?
Not one death in a village has ever had a test or a postmortem to find out how that person died. Till about a month and a half ago, urban deaths in hospitals, which were not COVID hospitals, were not
Hmm.
counted as COVID deaths. COVID also kills people with comorbidities. They're attributed to the comorbidity and not to COVID. I would say it is not just by the figures that government publishes, but the fact that so many people are ill, and even our ordinary virus illness makes you more susceptible to a bigger virus. More people have died of tuberculosis, more women have died in childbirth even now, more children have died for premature birth and all the other issues that plague rural India. All that is true, and that was true when other pandemics struck. But still, globally, COVID is a reality, and for the last 1 week, India has overtaken both the United States and Brazil to be topping in that, and that is not an area where India wants to lead the world.
And one thing that question, has within it, your response really is that uh, many the figures are not real. What we see, I mean, they're not fudged, but they're not real because there are a number of people not tested. And we really don't know. So in a country like India, there's one side where testing is not taking place, so we don't know whether it's the COVID or their comorbidity that caused it. And the other thing is the government, you know, keeping the figures down, uh, economic figures as well as the pandemic figures. So we have that struggle that there is in the government and in the figures we see. And so whatever the question was, it says is, are we overplaying it? Are we overemphasizing? I don't think it is an overemphasis. Caution is something that we must continue to exhibit. Santosh, any other question?
But Ken, you will remember, I began by saying, I'm not
Yeah.
going to remember 2020
Yeah.
for COVID, but
Yeah.
for what it brought with it.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
was the point.
Yeah, I think that was powerful, very, very clear. Santosh, any other question? One
No more
more?
questions, but I'd like for Dr. John to give us a message of hope that we can pass on to our children. A
Good.
number of us are teachers here, and we work with children. I have children. They seem to be very optimistic and positive about the road ahead. It's just us older folk who seem to be weighed down by this burden. So a message of
Good.
hope that we can pass on to the next generation.
Good, John. That'll be a nice concluding comment from you. A nice concluding
If
comment.
Santosh is old, I must be Methuselah, because I have grandchildren. And whatever I do, howsoever bitter I am sometimes, I say it in the end. I am bitter, I'm angry, I'm annoyed. Not for myself, I don't care. I've lived my life, I and Ken. And I mean, he's a famous man, but I haven't done too bad for myself either. But it is our investment in India and in the world is deep, is to you, Santosh, and your children, and my grandchild Kabir. And hopefully, in another 20 years, his grandchildren. Investment in this country. And the biggest bequeath we can give them, the patrimony that we can give them, is hope. Hope in a democracy, hope in the strength of the people, hope that 2024 there will be a change for the better in states and municipalities, at the center, at the United Nations. Hope in peace, that people will learn. I tell
Wonderful.
people, I ask a simple question of children and grown up, and I ask this of politicians, how far do you think India is from Pakistan? All of them give me the distance, either between Amritsar and Lahore or between Delhi and Islamabad. On the ground, the distance between India and Pakistan is 1 inch, is the width of a steel rod on which the wires are strung. Anything that happens in India, if the wind blows west, it goes to Pakistan. Any virus from Pakistan, if the wind blows east, will come to India. We will learn how to live with each other. We have learned how to live with a neighbor without coveting his wife and his money and killing his sheep. We have learned to live. That is civilization, that is evolution. We are still an evolving democracy, not an evolved democracy.
You mentioned that a lost opportunity we had as a subcontinent to come together rather than, bringing in war and things of the border problems. And for me, the reality is something we must accept and we've got to embrace. And the hope is that the human race has such a tremendous built-in resilience that they will get over it. I mean, there were as severe pandemics in the sense of wars, and there was a pandemic in the earlier part of the last century. We got over it. The human race got over it and survived, kept going economically, boomed, blossomed. So there is hope. Over to you, Santosh, to conclude.
Thank you very much. Paraphrasing the words of Gloria Gaynor, we will survive. Thank you, Dr. John Dayal. Thank you, Dr. Gnanakan. And thank you everyone else for joining us for this webinar. Let's leave this with hope. God bless you all.
Amen, amen.
Enjoy the rest of your evening. Bye-bye.